Okay, that's it for today, folks. Thanks for coming. Hope you've had an enjoyable morning. I could listen to that all day and just be content. Um, so I
Hello.
want. Oh, was someone about to say something?
Can I just say a couple
Oh,
things before we get
that's right. You're going to introduce me. I'm
started?
already in the zone.
I just wanted to introduce Carol Mansoor, and I just wanted all of you to join me in welcoming her and to really thank her for being willing to come and have these difficult conversations with us, as we know they're not easy. And so I also wanted to just maybe give a little bit of background so that everybody knows, which was in the email, but I'm just going to read it because I think it'll just give some context to her background. So she grew up in a segregated Pentecostal church, and she was confused as to why white and Black Pentecostals did not worship together, and was convinced that all y'all were going to hell. So her spiritual search led her as an adult to the Bahá'í Faith, which teaches that world peace will be assured when women globally will have achieved full equality with men, and when racism in the US is obliterated. Many years and many pounds ago, Carol was a television reporter and anchor. She and her husband now own a firm which does accounting for small businesses. And so this is a little bit of Carol Mansour's background, and I'm sure we're going to hear more in her presentation about her own experiences. There are just a couple things before I pass it on that I wanted to mention. So first of all, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming. It's always such an honor for so many people to want to join these conversations. The first thing I wanted to mention is that the talk is being recorded. And so just to put that out there so that you know that it's going to be recorded and most likely uploaded to YouTube. The second thing that I wanted to mention is that this is a space where we will be having difficult conversations. And so you're coming into this space with the understanding that most likely you're going to be uncomfortable and experience discomfort. And so that should be the norm with these kind of conversations and not the exception. So just keep that in mind as you listen and to the conversation. And then also, please do not chat. I disabled the chat right now, and we're going to be taking questions at the end of the presentation and not during the presentation. And so just keep that in mind. The chat is disabled. We will most likely turn it back on once the presentation is over. And lastly, during the discussion, please be mindful of not taking up too much space. I know there's a lot of people who will be wanting to participate in the discussion. And so just please keep that in mind. And we will organize that by having people raise their little blue hand and then call people that way. And is there anything else that I forgot, Carol?
I can't
that
think
you
of
would like to
anything.
add?
I don't have a very good track record. I forgot you were going to introduce me. So I'm not the person to ask if you've forgotten anything.
Okay, all right.
You should probably ask somebody else.
I'm going to pass it on to you. There we go.
Okay, all right.
Welcome, Carol.
Thank you, thank you. It's an absolute honor to be here. But I was telling Maggie Damgani the last time that we presented that I, got all dressed up and I put on a full face of makeup. And then I found out a couple of hours after the presentation that my camera wasn't working, so you never saw me. So if you saw the last presentation, just pretend that I was stunning. So I'm gonna apologize also in advance for this PowerPoint. I have a New Yorker cartoon that has a picture of Satan talking to one of his minions. And he says something to the effect of, we need someone well-versed in torture. Do you know anybody who knows PowerPoint? And normally my PowerPoints are not this long, but I wanted to share some quotes. I wanted to make sure I got them right. And I wanted to share some quotes that you might not be familiar with. I know that for a lot of Baha'is, this quote is something that you've heard many times. Let the white make a supreme effort in their resolve to contribute their share to the solution of this problem, to abandon once and for all their usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority, to correct their tendency towards revealing a patronizing attitude towards the members of the other race, to persuade them through their intimate, spontaneous, and informal association with them of the genuineness of their friendship and the sincerity of their intentions, and to master their impatience of any lack of responsiveness on the part of people who have received for so long such grievous and slow healing wounds. Let the Negroes, through a corresponding effort on their part, show by every means in their power the warmth of their response, their readiness to forget the past, and their ability to wipe out every trace of suspicion that may still linger in their hearts. And that's from Shoghi Effendi's love letter to the United States and Canada. That's how Eric Dozier describes it. The Advent of Divine Justice, which was written in December of 1937 and received by the believers in North America in 1938. So one thing you may not know about the Advent of Divine Justice is that it's a direct result of this woman's pilgrimage. Sadie Oglesby was the first African-American female pilgrim to the Holy Land. She went in 1927, and she had several conversations with the Guardian while she was on pilgrimage. And Sadie was a woman of her time, and she was also a bit hesitant to bring up the issue of race in her Baha'i community. And so when the Guardian kept asking her, how many Black believers are there? And she would kind of try to change the subject, and he kept bringing him back. And every day when the Guardian would ask, why aren't there more Black believers? And other people would try to change the subject, because if you think it's uncomfortable to talk about race in 2020, imagine what it was like to talk about race a century ago. And the Guardian would brush everybody off and say, no, this is vitally important that we address this. So I'm going to share some of the quotes from Sadie's convention report to the Baha'is of the United States and Canada. But I will tell you that after her pilgrimage, one of the things that she said to the Guardian was, I'm just one person, nobody's going to listen to me. And the Guardian asked, do you think it would help if I wrote something? And she said, yes. So he wrote a couple of things. The first was a letter that he wrote shortly after her pilgrimage. And the second, roughly 10 years later, was the Advent of Divine Justice. So this was from her convention report. She's quoting Shoghi Effendi. When the believers get their hearts free from prejudice, the colored believers will come into the cause. And when the colored people come in and are made welcome, I want you to remember that segment, and are made welcome, then the whites will come flocking in. The white people of America are watching to see what the Baha'is are going to do with the colored people. When they see the white Baha'is treating the colored Baha'is as themselves, then they will believe they are sincere. The people of the East are watching to see what the Baha'is of America are going to do with the colored people. And unless the Baha'is remove the prejudice and establish a center where brotherhood and justice is practiced toward colored people, there will be no center to which to turn when the world is in its great turmoil. I don't know about you, but I kind of think the world is in its great turmoil right now. And if this is not the great turmoil, I'm not sure I want to see what it is. My charge to you is that when you go back to America, tell the friends to look within themselves and find there the reason so few colored people are in the cause, and remove this reason. Until this is removed, the cause cannot grow. This is vital. And this is found in a couple of places. One is Shoghi Effendi Through the Pilgrim's Eye, Volume 1, and another is in a book called Lights of the Spirit, which is historical portraits of Black Baha'is in North America. This is from the letter that Shoghi Effendi wrote to the NSA of the United States and Canada within just a few weeks of Sadie's pilgrimage. I cannot believe that those whose hearts have been touched by the regenerating influence of God's creative faith in his day will find it difficult to cleanse their souls from every lingering trace of racial animosity so subversive in the faith they profess. How can hearts that throb with the love of God fail to respond to all the implications of this supreme injunction of Baha'u'llah, the unreserved acceptance of which, under the circumstances now prevailing in America, constitutes the hallmark of a true Baha'i character? Let every believer desirous to witness the swift and healthy progress of the cause of God realize the twofold nature of his task. Let him first turn his eyes inwardly and search his own heart and satisfy himself that in his relations with his fellow believers, irrespective of color and class, he is proving himself increasingly loyal to the spirit of his beloved faith. Let him wage a constant fight against the inherited tendencies, the corruptive instincts, the fluctuating fashions, the false pretenses of the society in which he lives. So, what would a supreme effort look like? Remember back in that earlier slide that Shoghi Effendi said that he listed all of the things that people were supposed to do, but white people were supposed to do, but he said that it would take a supreme effort. And a supreme effort means that it's the ultimate, it's the final, the highest degree. And I don't know how many of you have worked for something really, really hard, whether you were struggling to pass a test or build a house or, whatever you were trying to do. But if you made a supreme effort, it occupied a lot of your time and energy. You consulted with other people about how to do it best. You were exhausted from the effort. There were times when you weren't sure you were going to make it. That is what a supreme effort looks like. And I'm going to remind everybody to mute yourselves if you're not muted, because I'm hearing something that's not me. Some of you may know the story of Violet Liuzzo. She was a homemaker in Michigan who watched the civil rights struggle playing out in the South, and she decided she was going to do something about it. So she left her 5 children and her husband at home, and she said, I'm going to go down for a few weeks, and I want to be a part of making a difference. She participated in the Selma to Montgomery March, and she was doing what she could. She was, serving as a chauffeur. She would, do whatever was needed in the effort. And one day she had gone to the Montgomery airport to pick up some civil rights activists. And as she was driving away from the airport, Ku Klux Klan members opened fire in her car and they killed her. Somehow her name has not been as widely known as some of the other people involved in the civil rights movement. But when you look at a supreme effort, knowing the dangers that you're facing and still doing it requires tremendous courage. And Violet Liuzzo had that. Reverend James Reeb is another white civil rights martyr that you may or may not have heard of. There's an excellent podcast series called Throughline, THROUGHLINE, that tells the story of the case that just languished for years. He was working in the cause in the South. And when he was beaten and attacked, he was taken to the white hospital in town, but they wouldn't treat him because he was a civil rights activist. And they took him to the black hospital where they tried to stabilize him, but they didn't have the resources to treat him. So he had to be driven for nearly 2 hours to the nearest town with a white hospital that would treat him. And by then it was too late. He died a few days later. But that's another example of someone who, knowing what he would be facing, decided to do the work anyway. But something I want to point out to you is that Shoghi Effendi told Sadie Oglesby in 1927, at the height of lynching, at, the zenith of the activities of the Klan, when there was all sorts of things going on against people working for equality, he told her that the Baha'is would not be molested if they undertook this work. Now, can you imagine? All of the things that are going on, people who are not Baha'is, who do not have this assurance, are rising to do this. And the Guardian tells Sadie that the Baha'is, if you do this, you will not be molested. So what can you do to evidence that love supreme? Well, if you're undertaking a supreme effort, you might want to start one step at a time. And you might want to start with being a bad white person. So I'm going to share with you what that means.
As Southerners, we have an intimate relationship with the land, the dirt. In fact, when we want to talk about hard work, we even say things like, you got to roll your sleeves up and get your hands dirty.
Sorry, I have this habit of listening to videos at double speed. So let me try this again.
As Southerners, we have an intimate relationship with the land, the dirt. In fact, when we want to talk about hard work, we even say things like, you got to roll your sleeves up and get your hands dirty. And man, I wish we had that energy for working against white supremacy in the world. Because for a people that love meritocracies, we have not been pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps in racial justice work. Now, by now you might be thinking, well, just like a classroom, aren't bullies and hall monitors in the minority? What about the majority of white people? What about the rest of the class? And I'm sure the majority of the white people you know are diversity-loving, inclusive people who stand against racism. And decades of survey data show us that racial attitudes of whites have improved over the years. The problem is racist policies have largely stayed the same, or in many cases gotten worse. We now have what sociologist Bonilla Silva describes as racism without racist. Well, how did we get here? During the civil rights era, white people saw ourselves in a mirror through the violent images we saw in the paper and on TV. We didn't like what we saw. So we distanced ourselves from those bad white people and created a culture where not seeing race became a way to be good in the world. And that's how we got the colorblind classroom. So whereas hall monitors wear whiteness to get goods, the colorblind classroom wears whiteness to be good. And we show our goodness as non-racist by blaming white bullies, closing our eyes to race, or by shrinking in shame or silence to show our agreement with its badness. Whiteness here is worn like a uniform. But our silent seriousness has meant that we don't have anything serious to say, even when we do want to speak about race. In 2006, for example, 100 middle-class white parents volunteered to be part of a study where they would talk to their children openly about race. And what's most interesting about that study is not the findings, but the fact that the study never happened. Only 6 out of the 100 parents were able to have open conversations with their children about race. The others either dropped out saying, I just couldn't bring myself to do it, or I didn't have the words, or if I did, I reverted back to colorblind language like we're all just the human race. As a class clown, what always bothered me about the silence of the classroom was that goodness was about conformity, replacing thinking for oneself with the approval of groupthink. And the problem with shame and colorblind goodness is that they are like emotional straitjackets, tying our hands and covering our mouths when it comes to race. The problem is we've been bad students of racism. Not only have we not done our homework, but we've been working on the wrong assignment, our goodness. Instead of listening and learning to the voices of those experiencing racism and then joining them in fighting it, we've been working on another project altogether. And I would know, because I've spent most of my life trying really hard to be a good white person. I love making people laugh, and I pride myself on having friends from all walks of life and from all around the world, but eventually I realized that my goodness made me feel good, but it wasn't doing much for making the world good. And my goodness felt lifeless in the face of mass incarceration and the racial wealth gap, immigrant rights and police brutality, and it feels lifeless now when I see the way that whiteness is killing white people too. Through the opioid epidemic, suicide rates, and white poverty, you see the goodness of non-racism is no match for the badness of racism. We are living through another mirror moment in history. Through the shrinking white population and the rise of social media, white people are looking at our robes of whiteness once again. And our closets are mostly full with the masks of bullies, the stiff shirts of hall monitors, or the uniforms of the colorblind classroom. So it's time we get some new clothes. Because we do not choose the skins we're born with, but we do choose how we'll wear them. I've been thinking a lot about the class clown as a metaphor for how can be better bad white people and turning a mirror back on the lies and stupidity of white supremacy in all its robes. You see, it wasn't until I started speaking up about injustice in the world that I became a bad white person. People love clowns that make them laugh. They kill clowns that make them think. But I've also thought about several teachers along the way during my class clown years who pulled me aside at the end of the year and they said, Travis, even though you disrupted class a lot, you also brought us a lot of joy. And that's a tension I'm still living with today, and one I want to encourage you to embrace. Find ways to bring joy to the world through your disobedience. Because I believe every one of us has a little spark of rebellion inside of us that gives us freedom to speak back to the world. And I know that there is comfort and security in hiding in the robes of whiteness, but there's greater freedom in throwing off those robes, robbing you of a voice in the world. So find your voice. Be rebellious. Be bad white people. Thank you.
He said a couple of things I want to point out to you. Well, that was the second half of the video. In the first half, he talks about growing up as the class clown. And he said he was a terrible student, so he was, always making people laugh. But he noticed that there were a couple of extremes in the classroom. One extreme was the bullies, the people who were in pain, and so they inflicted pain on other people. And at the other extreme were the hall monitors, the people who tried to enforce everybody's behavior. And so he said that what he did as the class clown was mirror the behavior back to people. So what you saw was what he perceived. He said he became an expert at people watching, because he wasn't doing the classwork. So he was watching the students and seeing how everybody behaved. His name is Travis Jones, by the way. And it's really interesting that what he says is that there's a spark of a rebel in people, but it's not being fed. Well, in the Bahá'í Faith, we know that spark is the power of the Holy Spirit, which should be manifesting in us and empowering us to do this work. And back during the devotions, one of the quotes, I think it was one that Evie read, that said, "Verily God has chosen you for his love and knowledge." So you didn't volunteer for this work. I just want to remind you, you did not volunteer for this. God chose you. So what better collaborator could you have? So I've got just a few more slides to share with you. And they won't be nearly so painful, I promise. Most of you have seen this woman. She's known as BBQ Becky. But what you may not remember is the reason that you know who she is because there was a white person who stood up to her. She was in a park in the San Francisco Bay Area, and there was a Black family that was having a barbecue in the designated barbecue area of the park. And she decided to call 911 and report them. And when she was confronted by another white person, then she became not as sure of her rightness. Then her stance switched from being basically a hall monitor, where she was going to police the behavior of this Black family, to presenting herself as a victim, because the white woman who confronted her and followed her and kept asking her, "Why are you doing this?" Wouldn't let up. And I'm not advocating that you approach every person in a combative way. But I am suggesting that if you don't do anything, the bullies of the world will feel empowered. I'm going to remind you that in the hidden words, Baha'u'llah tells us to bring thyself to account each day, ere thou art summoned to a reckoning. So these are some of the things that you can do daily to practice that love supreme, or being a bad white person. You can trust Black people to read our reality. When we tell you that something is racially biased or racially prejudiced, or that an experience that we had smacks of racism, trust us. For most white Persians and other white adjacent people, examining society through the lens of racism and racial prejudice and racial justice is a relatively new exercise. We, on the other hand, have had to do this to ensure our survival. So we are much better at figuring this out. So if someone says to you, I had this experience and this person was being racially prejudiced toward me, the appropriate response is not, well, I don't think that's prejudice if you are not a Black person. Because what you're saying is, I don't believe you can see the reality and report it accurately. I think maybe I can do that better than you. And trust me, you cannot. You really cannot. What you are telling me when you tell me that you don't believe what I'm saying to you, or that there's 73 other reasons this might have happened, what you're telling me is that I cannot trust you to be the support that I need you to be. I cannot trust you to be seriously interested in establishing a community that is a refuge from racial prejudice. You need to examine your biases. Remember when the Guardian said one of the first things you need to do is look inside yourself and see where you are racially prejudiced. And in the Advent of Divine Justice, he says that there's a subconscious sense of superiority. That means you don't see it. It's subconscious. It's not top of mind. So when someone says to you that something you've said was racially insensitive, or that something you've done may be biased, if you respond by saying, I'm the least prejudiced person I know, then my first thought is, well, you need to meet more people. But my second thought is, if you're weighing your behavior against the other people around you, that's the false standard. As Baha'is, we're told to measure ourselves against the master. And there was no doubt about where he stood on the issue of racial justice. Educate yourself about the history and legacy of racism. It's going to be very painful. It's going to take you a long time. Every day, you're going to learn things that break your heart, that make you angry, that upset you. And then you're going to start seeing patterns that are playing out today that are exactly like those things that happened 100, 200, 300 years ago, that some things very much have not changed. Share that education with other whites, Persians, and white adjacent people around you, because they will listen to you when they won't listen to someone who looks like me. Amplify our voices, but don't speak over us. Don't tell us how to be Black in America. Don't tell other people how we should be as Black people in America. That's not the role for you. If I tell you I'm hurting, that I fell and I broke my toe, your job is to repeat that I'm hurting, I fell and I broke my toe. Not, I shouldn't have been wearing those shoes, I shouldn't have been on those steps, I shouldn't have, that's not your role. Your role is not to tell me the remedy. Your role is to amplify my voice and interrupt racism where you see it. There's always a way. It can be as simple as saying, I don't agree. There was an episode once where someone reported being in a store in the checkout line, and the person at the front of the line was berating the cashier and making all sorts of racist remarks. And there was a long line of people who were mostly white. And one of them decided, I can't take this. So rather than confront the individual, he turned to all the people in line and said, if you believe this is wrong, I want you to join me in singing. And they started singing a song. I can't remember if it was We Shall Overcome It. It was something, but they all started singing to let the person at the front of the line know, we are all in agreement that what you're doing is reprehensible and needs to stop. So at this point, I've talked so long that my laptop's running out of battery, and I'm sure you have questions and comments. So let me plug my laptop in, and Elizabeth, if you want to open the chat and people can start putting their questions in. I'm going to ask you to take a good 10 to 15 seconds though before you start typing your questions, and think about the question. Say it out loud to yourself with your while you're still muted, because sometimes your question comes at the end of like 2 minutes of reflection out loud. So if you need to do that reflection out loud first, do it muted. And then when you have the question, you can type the question in the chat. So I'm just going to reach out of frame here for a second.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Carol. Also, if you would like to actually verbally share your question, you can begin raising your hand and I will call on people accordingly, and I will open the chat in about 5 seconds. Chat has been opened. You can also raise your little blue hand. I'm not able to see everybody on the screen. So if you have your hand raised, I may not be able to see you. And the way to raise your blue hand is to go to participants, and at the bottom, depending on, okay, great. Solomon, I see your hand up. Please unmute yourself.
Hello. Wow, 57 people and I'm the first one. I had a couple comments, and rather than questions, actually, because I'm actually finding it rather remarkable. I've done a few presentations and I'm in a lot of conversations on race these days as to how common how much in common all of these comments have, and how common the Black experience is in America. I hear a lot of the same thing. And my general feeling about a lot of it is, well, this is not new. And so, Carol, what you have said all this time, all I've been doing is going through my mind and saying, yep, yeah, that's right, yeah. I did want to put forward just on the last list of things that you said. Well, let me flip this. There were two things. The first being the notion of what is kind of necessary as far as supreme effort and changing in this country. And one of the foundational things that I've discovered is that we have to, in essence, deconstruct what America, or what people have always thought America to be. We spend there's a lot of time that we've bought into the sales pitch of America being the greatest country with all its democracies and all of its freedoms and all that aspirational stuff, which is, half of it's true. It is aspirational. The reality is that it has been hypocritical from day one, in that the country itself, all of the founders decided that they came here to have all that individual freedom and all the inalienable rights. Their emphasis on inalienable, which means that no man can decide, you know, what rights you have. They are God-given. But they promptly decided that they could take away the rights of entire peoples. From day one, the grand hypocrisy is they decided they could treat a group of people in the most heinous and embarrassing and dehumanizing ways possible. And they did it for decades upon decades upon decades upon decades. And that's the grand hypocrisy that gave them a lot of workarounds when they talked about freedom. And they've been using those workarounds for the entire existence of this country. And until we can deconstruct that, and I'm not saying that means dissolving the aspirations of what America is supposed to be, but to emphasize the degree of effort that is going to have to be made. We have to divorce ourselves from the notion of how great this country is so we can actually get around to making the changes that make the country what we hope it to be, rather than falling back on believing that all it takes is a few tweaks, and
Absolutely.
that it can be done painlessly.
Yes, there's a prayer for America that was offered in 1912 when Abdu'l-Baha was visiting the United States. And in that prayer, he asked for this country to, in spiritual degrees, to be blessed as much as it has aspired to material degrees. And I think something that a lot of people forget is that this was a nation founded on stolen land, on the backs of stolen people. And neither of those thefts have been atoned for. There have not been reparations to either aggrieved party, and the theft continues, both of the land and of the labor. So we have a lot to do. And I want to thank you for bringing that up, Solomon, because what an action item for you to consider is that there has been a bill introduced in, I believe it's the House of Representatives to, oh goodness, I lost my thought. Oh shoot, I'm gonna remember it. Janae, you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, you're talking about.
Repeal the 13th Amendment.
There you go.
Yes, yeah. It's been introduced in the Senate to repeal the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which is the amendment, not the entire amendment, because that's the amendment that emancipated slaves, but it left in a clause that allows slavery to continue as punishment for a crime. So there's been legislation introduced that would repeal that segment of the 13th Amendment. So something that you can do as individuals is to contact your US Senate members and ask them to support this effort.
You might also mention the anti-lynching bill that Senator Harris and
you go for it, Janae.
might as well get them all out at the same time. But the anti-lynching bill, as well as the amendment to close the loophole in the 13th Amendment. So both of those, be on the lookout for.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janae. So we have Tahereh who has her hand up, and then I have a couple questions in chat, and then I'll come back to Chuck. So
Okay.
that will be the order.
Tahereh. Aloha to everybody. Solomon actually answered most of my questions.
Okay.
But I was living in Iran until 1979, and we had a lot of African American who, when the king was over there, they used to come over there and work, and everybody loved them. I'm
gonna stop you right there. I'm gonna stop you right there.
Okay.
There is a tendency among people who've immigrated to this country to reflect on how African Americans or people of African descent were treated in their home countries. And I have to stop there and say that the experience of the Black people may not be what you perceived it to be.
Okay.
Because from your perspective, it might have been that they were treated well, that everybody loved them, but on the other side, that's not necessarily the case.
Okay, that's why I didn't finish yet. But
okay.
when I came over here, I see different view, and it breaks my heart because to me, we all are human. It doesn't matter what color of skin you have, and who gives a right to a white person to think she or he is better than a black person. That breaks my heart, and that's my question. Who gave them the right to think that?
All right, I'm gonna suggest another speaker for another Sunday, and I'll send you her name, Liz. Actually, there's like 2 or 3 different people, but one is Bita Bagulizadeh. She is a scholar of Persian history, and she has done tremendous work on the history of African slavery in Iran. And the fact that after emancipation 100 years ago, the Persian government decided that not only would they emancipate the African slaves, but they would pretend it never happened. So you could grow up and be highly educated in Iran and never know the extent of African slavery in Iran. And I have gotten into, I don't want to say arguments, more like knockdown, drag out fights with Persians who assure me that there is no racism in Iran because they're all the same color. Well, this would come as a tremendous surprise to Afro-Persians who speak of their treatment by fairer-skinned Persians the same way Black people in this country talk about our treatment of white people. So rather than diverge from, what anti-Black, debating and working on anti-Blackness in the United States rather than shifting it to anti-Blackness in Iran, I would invite you to have as a future speaker someone who is well-versed on that topic, because there's only recently has the government begun to actively release some of the archival information. But the legacy is that Afro-Persians feel very much the sting of anti-Blackness in Iran and in the diaspora around the world. That it's almost the same words, but with a Persian accent. Their treatment by Persians of fairer skin as it is Black people in this country. So that's one of the blind spots that a lot of people who are not Black have, is that, well, in my country, it was different. In my country, we didn't do this. I'm always astounded when Europeans tell me that they grew up without racism. I think, where do they think it started? So it may not be visible to you because you're not on the receiving end, but it's there. Anti-Blackness is global, and there's no, unless and until the Universal House of Justice says that there's a population that is exempt from this, I'm operating on the assumption that when Shoghi Effendi and the Universal House of Justice said this is a job for everybody, that includes everybody. So I'm gonna step off that soapbox and be prepared to step up on another one.
Thank you so much. There were a couple questions in the chat, and then I'll come back to Chuck, and then it'll be Dennis. The first one was asking if we could share the information in the What You Can Do slide in the chat. And if you give me permission, I can do that and add the information to the chat. I know I have a copy of your PowerPoint, so I can copy
okay.
it.
I don't think it changed after I sent it to you, because
okay.
But just in case, I'll put it in the chat now.
Oh, perfect. And then Brian asked if you could recommend some movies and lists, books or podcasts or things like that, where you can learn about racism.
Yeah, I could, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you to Maggie. Help me. Is it besj.wordpress.com?
I'll put it in the chat, but
okay.
yeah, BES.org.wordpress. But
I always leave something out. A couple of years ago, I guess it was, oh man, it's been almost 4 years. It was early 2017. I was participating in discussions about race on a platform on Facebook in a group. And whenever the whites and Persians became uncomfortable, the admins would shut down the discussion. So several of us who found ourselves on the same side of the discussion decided to form a group dedicated to discussing race from a Baha'i perspective. And Maggie was one of those initial stalwart souls. And she does a lot of the heavy lifting. So on that website that she put in the chat, we have done blog posts where we list books. We have a separate blog post about movies, a blog post about podcasts. And we probably need to update it because that's been at least a year or so ago. And there's just been so much more in the last year. But there's a lot to get you started if you head to that website.
Kim had a quick question. She said, could you please repeat the name of the book that had stories of early African-American Baha'is? Thank you.
Yes, I'm going to ask you to put your view on speaker view. I'm going to show you the book, and then I will also put the name of it in the chat. So shift your view to speaker view, and where am I? Oh, there I am. Okay. It's called Lights of the Spirit, Historical Portraits of Black Baha'is in North America. This is excellent. This is by Gwen Eder Lewis and Richard Thomas. It's absolutely fabulous. And for more history and how it's affected the legacy of race in America and what you can do all through a Baha'i lens, I cannot recommend highly enough the Wilmette Institute course on anti-Blackness in America. It's like sipping from a fire hose, but you have access to the materials for several months after the initial course. It's self-paced. I find that I get the most out of it when I reflect with a group of people. That not only holds me accountable for actually doing the work, but it also lets me see, thank you, Maggie. I already forgot I was going to put that in the chat. It lets me see how what inspired other people, what insights they had. And so it fills up quickly. I think the next cohort will be in February, but there are also talks that the Wilmette Institute has sponsored that are on the website. So check out the Wilmette Institute course on anti-Blackness in America. It changes every time it's given, and every time it just gets better and better and better.
Thank you. Chuck, you're next. And then it'll be Dennis. And then there are a couple more questions in the chat, and then Solomon.
Thank you, Liz. Can you hear me okay? I'm driving.
Yes.
Yes.
No, it's a little bit noisy. Carol, thank you so much for your presentation and reminding me about what a supreme effort really entails, and reminding me of how much more I personally need to do. That supreme is the extreme. I also appreciated the reading Liz read about I Desire Distinction for You. And that reminded me of a story in The Fire Next Time where James Baldwin was visiting Elijah Muhammad, and Elijah was talking about the white devils, and James Baldwin was thinking about white friends that he had, and he was about to bring up that he had white friends that he considered good white friends, and he realized how few he actually had that he could actually rely upon, or who would die for him, be willing to die for him. And so he didn't bring it up because those were just exceptions. And it just made me think when I read that quote from Abdu'l-Baha, and how important it is for me to be a trustworthy white person, to be someone that my friends of color can rely upon, and who attempts not to center myself. And that's the last thing I would just say, that I think for me as a white person, as a white man, I've fallen into pitfalls on this long and thorny road. It's the constant thing that happens, and it helps me to. I've been doing some reading recently, an article called "Loving Whiteness to Death," which is incredibly powerful, that I highly recommend. First recommended it to me, but just talks about how deeply interwoven whiteness is into people with white bodies, and how hard and almost impossible it will be to extricate it all. And it's a lifetime effort, but that we have to make every effort we can to become authentic, loving human beings. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you, Carol, very much.
Thank you, Chuck. And I wanted to say something. Chuck had mentioned, James Baldwin trying to figure out how many white friends he had. And it's fairly common for white Persian and white adjacent people to tell you about, my best friend is Black, or I've got this Black friend or that Black friend. And the important question is, on the flip side, would this person consider you a friend? There's a really funny clip from Trevor Noah. It might have been a different late night show where they would stop people on the street and ask them, do you have any Black friends? No, it wasn't Trevor Noah, it was Jimmy Kimmel. And so most of the time, when people would say yes, they would say, well, do you have their phone number? And if it was no, it's like, well, how good friends can you be? And so it was just really interesting that people assume a friendship when I might consider you an acquaintance. But if I can't call on you in a crisis, you are not my friend. And I want to share a quote from Andre Henry, who is an activist in Los Angeles that I follow on social media. And I feel like I should have this emblazoned on a t-shirt or maybe tattooed on my forehead. If you find yourself feeling the need to tell someone from a marginalized group, I'm an ally, you're probably better off holding off of saying anything, taking a step back and asking yourself why they couldn't recognize you.
Thank you.
I'll put that in the chat.
Please do. Thank you. The next question is from Dennis. If you can unmute yourself.
Yes, I have. Thank you. It's a comment, not a question. I would like to express my undying gratitude to all those dear Black folk who have over the years helped me read my reality. I say that mainly because I know that usually that offer to help read a white person's reality is not thanked at all, and is a very brave thing to do. Just that, my gratitude.
Thank you, Dennis.
Yeah, divisive is my middle name. But I do want to point out that if you have not already read it, I would urge you to read Dr. Derek Smith's essay on centering the pupil of the eye. And it was groundbreaking for me. I thought I understood the pupil of the eye metaphor that Baha'u'llah uses, but the work that Dr. Smith does, putting it into historical context and in current context, is just fabulous. And so if he hasn't been a guest already, you should really, he should be the next person you bring on. But he was giving a discussion, he was leading a discussion about his essay. And a person who was not of African descent said that it seems that these days that whites and Persians can't do they can't say anything right, that everything they say is offensive. And it's almost like Black people are looking for reasons to get upset. And the thought bubble over my head was full of words that were not meet or seemly. So it's probably just as well that I was not in a position, that I was not the one being asked to respond. And Derek is so warm and loving. And he said, one of the things that you have to remember when the Guardian said to Black people that you have to white people, that you have to make the supreme effort to let go of the subconscious sense of superiority, this, unintentional arrogance, all of this patronizing attitude, you have to let go of all of that. And then he turned to Black people and said, and you have to let go of your suspicion and be willing to forget the past. On a visceral level, Black people knew that we were being asked something that was really, really hard, because our suspicion of white people, our knowledge of the past, our reaction to what is happening around us based on the past and our suspicion has been a survival mechanism. We would not have survived without being suspicious of some of the things that white people do. So we knew this is a big ask. I don't know if I can do the show you Fendi, because that's huge. On the other hand, when white people are told to get rid of that patronizing attitude and subconscious sense of superiority, Derek said the usual reaction is, oh, I don't have a subconscious sense of superiority. I don't have a patronizing attitude. I'm good. So the work isn't done, because if you don't think it applies to you, you're not going to do it. So I think that's a huge hurdle to get over, is recognizing that the Guardian did not include your name and an asterisk as the exception to the rule, because you were the one person who didn't have that subconscious sense of superiority. He didn't exclude any group of people. I was in a conversation a few weeks ago where someone said, well, the Italians were discriminated against when they first came here, and the Irish weren't accepted, and he's going on and on. I'm thinking, wait a minute. Shoghi Effendi could have said, let the white, with the exception of the Irish who recently arrived, or the Italians, because, they didn't own slaves, or this group or that group. But he didn't do that, because he knew that all of these people, once they arrived in North America, they were white. And one of the things that they knew when they arrived was that whatever they weren't Black. So they were willing to go along with being, they made the Germans and the British may have hated each other before they came here. The French and the Hungarians may not have thought they had anything in common, but when they came here, they were white. And so when the Guardian said, let the white, he meant all of them. All right, off my soapbox.
Thank you so much, Carol. We have Janae and then Solomon. Janae, I'm just calling, Solomon, I'm just calling on Janae first, since she hasn't.
Oh, no, that's fine.
Okay, and then I'll call on you.
Thank you, Liz. I just wanted to add one more thing to what Carol has said. It is difficult for people who are using their instincts to survive to give that up when whites are not doing the corresponding thing. We can't respond to something if whites don't do it. And it becomes a vicious cycle, because to give up that suspicion means that the instinct to survive, we're putting on hold and trusting you. But if you're not doing the work, then it's kind of like lambs to a slaughter.
Amen to that. And thank you, Janae.
Thank you, Janae, for sharing that.